Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this live streamed presentation co-hosted by PEEC and the Valles Caldera National Preserve. Tonight's presentation is The Night Sky in May with Rick Wallace and Kelli Housley. I'm Laura Marcelia with Pajarito Environmental Education Center, or PEEC, located in Los Alamos, New Mexico. I'll be the moderator for tonight's talk. Tonight's talk is being recorded. We are able to offer programming at this time because of our wonderful members and donors. A big thank you to all of you who renewed your memberships last month. We'll send you an evaluation form after the talk, and we'll use your comments to improve future programs. Rick and Kelli will be taking questions via the Zoom chat. Type your questions for them into the chat window anytime during the show, and I will relay the questions to them. Rick Wallace has a PhD in astronomy and astrophysics from UC Santa Cruz. He worked as a staff member at Los Alamos National Laboratory for 30 years working on physics simulations. His hobbies include natural photography and astronomy education. Kelli Housley is a park ranger at Valles Caldera National Preserve. She's worked for 8 different parks within the National Park Service, ranging from smaller park sites like Natural Bridges National Monument to more well-known parks like the Grand Canyon. She's been involved with astronomy programming for 5 years, but has been interested in the night sky since before her time in the Park Service, and she's excited to share her enthusiasm with you tonight. And with that, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Laura. We'll start by talking a little bit about some recent astronomy events, actually. So these are things that have happened in the last few weeks and are probably notable. So we should talk about that first before we go into the night sky itself. The first one is the SpaceX Starship, selected by NASA for the moon landing vehicle. Now, there were 3 different vehicles by a host of different aerospace companies working together that were proposed to NASA to get the astronauts from the space station that's going to be built around the moon down to the surface of the moon for the next human space landing on the moon that is still scheduled, I believe, for 2024. And these were all very notable designs. The most far out design was the SpaceX design, because it proposed using the Starship, which is a absolutely huge, massive ship, and it was considered sort of a long chance for the selection. And it turns out NASA did select it. So SpaceX will be taking the next set of astronauts to the moon. Its Starship design is still in the test phase, but just yesterday, it finally succeeded in launching, doing a belly flop maneuver to re-enter from the 10-kilometer test height, and then turning upright and landing right smack in the middle of the landing zone. And previously, for the previous 14 tests, it generally exploded either on liftoff or on landing. But this one actually made it all the way through. So maybe it's not such a long shot after all. And I have a quick video of that.
Have ignition. Starship heading back to the landing zone.
And of course, I cut that video so you could only see the liftoff and the landing. You didn't see the several minutes in between, but it did accomplish all of its required test goals. Now, the next thing I'll talk about is a major meteor strike that occurred in Florida in the middle of April.
And the hallways even, some residents told us.
By a TV station.
Because, oh my gosh, what is that in the sky? Whoa.
and also caught on a security camera. Now, that was a bolide, or a fairly large object that entered the atmosphere. But that does bring up the fact that the Eta Aquarid meteor shower was this past week. In fact, it peaked yesterday and this morning. It does go on for several days, however. And so if you're interested, you might try going out this evening. If it's not too cloudy where you are, it's pretty cloudy here in my house, but sometime around midnight, closer to midnight, the better, or a little after. During the peak, it could have as many as 50 meteors per hour, a few less than that after the peak, such as tonight. The material entering the atmosphere is debris from Halley's Comet. The orbit of Halley's Comet crosses the orbit of the Earth. And when that happens, as the Earth's atmosphere moves into that bed of debris, some of it enters the atmosphere and causes meteor streaks. So be sure and wear warm clothes. It's usually best around midnight or a little after, but you can try earlier if you need to. Just find a really dark area and look kind of toward the east to the south. It could be anywhere in the sky. So that's the Eta Aquarid meteor shower. Now, in general, there are 25 million bits of debris that burn up in the Earth's atmosphere every single day. And these pieces are traveling 20 to 40 miles per second. That's like traveling from Los Alamos to Santa Fe in 1 second. So that's pretty fast. Now, most of the debris is dust and sand-sized particles. For example, the nuggets in grape nut cereal shown here are typical meteor-sized grains. But about 15,000 tons of material per year impact the Earth's atmosphere. The next thing I'll talk about is the man-made meteor that might occur this weekend. The Chinese Long March 5B rocket boosted the first part of the new Chinese space station into orbit. It was launched on April 29th, and instead of sending the space station into orbit and then having the booster come down in a controlled trajectory into the Pacific Ocean, the booster was a little too boosty, and it went up into orbit itself, and it's now orbiting the Earth. It is projected to come down sometime this weekend. It weighs 23 tons. It's the 10th largest man-made object to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. Re-entry is currently projected to be Saturday, May 8th, that's tomorrow, 5 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time, plus or minus 9 hours. So sometime during the day tomorrow or tomorrow night or Sunday morning, this thing should be re-entering the Earth's atmosphere and may be visible depending on what part of the atmosphere it enters. And it is the actual impact point won't really be known until a few hours before re-entry actually starts. So if you're interested, just Google Chinese rocket re-entry and during the day tomorrow, and see if you can get an update on when and where it's likely to land. Okay, now let's look a little bit into the skies. Before we start talking in too much detail, let me just give you this overview. And as you can tell, you can't really see much from this picture. So what I'm going to do is attempt to convince Zoom to show me a different picture. Now, with some luck, you'll be able to see that. Now we have Mars right here. You can see Gemini, the twins, Pollux and Castor here. And this is directly to the west. Let me turn the ground back on for the moment. So you can see about how far it is. It's setting into the western horizon. You can see Orion with Betelgeuse and the 3 belt stars. Probably the easiest thing to pick out, and then Gemini. Canis Minor, Procyon, the star of Procyon, the brightest star in Canis Minor, is a very bright star, as is Sirius in Canis Major. So you'll be able to see these three stars in Betelgeuse and Capella fairly well. And Mars is between Capella and Procyon, right here near the leg of Gemini. And it will be for the next few days. So even if it's cloudy tonight, maybe in the next few days it'll clear up enough to see it. Now, if you look in this bush, you see a little bright spot. I'm going to take the landscape away for a moment, and you can see that that little bright spot was the planet Mercury, and below that was Venus. Now Venus, here's the sun right down here to the lower right. Venus is too bright, too close to the sun to be seen. It's bright, but it's very close to the sun. And so you wouldn't be able to see Venus for another few weeks. In a couple of weeks, it'll begin to separate from the sun, and you'll be able to see it, and it will eventually become the dominant object in the western skies, the brightest spot of light for sure to the west by the end of the month. Meanwhile, Mercury is not nearly as bright and it's close to the sun, so it's difficult to see, but it is high enough to see it away from the sun, and it reaches maximum elongation on May 16th. That means that is the day in which Mercury will be as far from the sun as its orbit allows, and you will have the greatest separation between sunset and Mercury. So you can look at Taurus and the stars in the V of Taurus, the Hyades, and notice that Mercury is very close to that. It's above Venus. So if you can find Venus and the stars in the Hyades, you might be able to spot Mercury around the 16th of the month. And at this point, I'll let Kelli tell you a little bit more about various planets and other things that you might be able to see.
All right. Trying to get my video working, sorry. All right. Okay. So I'm gonna flip over to my PowerPoint. So let me know if this does not work. I think that works. So I wanted to go a little bit more in depth for at least two of the planets that we can see in the evening sky. I'm not much of a morning person, so I don't usually notice the planets that are up before sunrise. But I wanted to talk a little bit more in depth about some of the features that you could see with maybe really strong scopes, telescopes, or if you just like myself like to Google really awesome NASA pictures, you can kind of find some of these images as well. But both Mars and Venus have been in the news a lot the last few months, and I wanted to go a little bit more in depth with them. So while Mars is in Gemini, you guys can look up and try to imagine some of these geologic features. I'm not going to go super in depth because otherwise that's going to take all day, and I don't think you guys have that. So one of the most striking, let me see, there we go. One of the most striking features of Mars is this massive canyon that is possible to see with a really strong telescope. Honestly, I was not a believer in that until I saw it myself back in October. And it took a few glances into the telescope for me to realize that I was actually staring at this canyon. But this is known as Valles Marineris. This canyon is 2,500 miles across. So it's just this gash across the surface of Mars. So I know you guys heard that I worked at Grand Canyon. This one kind of puts Grand Canyon to shame. But it's this massive canyon and it's a really strong feature on Mars. But you can also see over here, you notice there are 3 spots, I guess, on Mars. And those are 3 of the volcanoes in what's called the Tharsis Volcanic Province, which does include this canyon. But right out of sight is this massive volcano known as Olympus Mons. So this is a lot more massive than a lot of the volcanoes that we find here. And I'm hoping a lot of you are familiar with Valles Caldera. I know that when you come around the corner on NM4 and you just see Valle Grande, this huge, massive valley that's 3 to 4 miles in diameter, that scope in and of itself is hard to imagine. And then knowing that the caldera itself has a diameter of 13 miles approximately across is hard for us to fathom. We can't always see it depending on where we are, but we just know that it's massive. Well, if we were able to stand on the rim of this caldera right here, this caldera is about 50 miles in diameter, 50. So it's massive. It's also about 2 miles deep. So you would have to be really careful on the edge of this caldera. But this is just a massive scale that I think would be hard for any of us to really comprehend, even if we were seeing it directly. But I think honestly, the real draw for a lot of people for Mars is this idea of life, or even just water, past water, current water, that really draws us to our current research there. So there is plenty of evidence that water had existed in the past and does continue to exist today. And if you can notice, a lot of this to me just looks like stream beds, and that's exactly what it was. You can see a lot of these stream flows, outflow channels. You can see a lot of that still remaining on the surface of Mars. You can also get sedimentary layers near lakes. You can see the Ma'adin Valles coming in to Gusev crater, but in some of these ancient lakes, you get these sedimentary layers, which can only be formed when in the presence of water. You also find minerals that can only be formed underwater, like hematite or other subaqueous minerals. And it's not like we've only found one sample. We have found hematite in multiple locations on Mars. So we know that there was water everywhere. I really like this picture. This was a rover that was digging, and it was finding frost just under an ice, just under the surface. The Viking 2 was actually finding frost in the morning on the surface that would melt by midday. So it is definitely possible to still find ice on Mars today, although don't picture it like ice that you'd put in your glass of water. It would be very, very salty to have any viability of living for a little while on Mars. So very briny, salty water, especially if it's going to be flowing. You can also find evidence of lava falls and waterfalls throughout the geography of Mars. But I think the coolest thing to look at is the topography of this planet. So you can see up here with the Northern Highlands, this blue color is the lowest elevation. The white that you're seeing is the highest. So you can see Olympus Mons right over here. But if you notice, all of the blue is really, really smooth, and the rest of it is really pockmarked and like it's had impact craters or other things affecting the surface. Whereas this could very easily have been smoothed out by water. So that's why a lot of people believe that the northern hemisphere of Mars would have been likely a giant ocean. There's evidence of ancient shorelines and even ancient tsunamis. You can see where boulders would have been carried by the force of the water. So it's really fascinating to try to imagine what might have been years ago. You also nowadays get lakes under the surface of Mars, not just the polar ice caps that we have, which is illustrated here, but we have found evidence of good-sized underground lakes on Mars too, which is really exciting. So we're still scratching the surface with what we know, and science continues on Mars. Notably, this past year, 3 different countries set off on missions to Mars. The United Arab Emirates sent an orbiter that arrived in February of this year, and that's the orbiter Hope, which I love that name. That's awesome. The Chinese mission, the Tianwen-1, was an orbiter and a lander. So the orbiter arrived in February, and the rover is expected to land this month. I didn't really get a date on that. Every time I tried to look for a more precise idea, it was all about the orbiter arriving in February. But the closest I found was mid-May. So hopefully in the next few weeks, we hear about a successful landing for the Tianwen-1. But then we've also got obviously NASA's mission. I think we're all pretty familiar with Perseverance, or hopefully we are. The Perseverance landed a few months ago. And the really cool thing about Perseverance, which is actually this rover right over here, the Perseverance is setting up to have samples returned to Earth. So it's collecting rocks and leaving it behind in a certain location on Mars, so that a mission in the future, from what I saw, probably 2028, a lander will come, collect those samples, and be able to bring them back to Earth. So right now, all we've been doing has been relying on these robots to do all of the lab studies and lab work and everything for us on Mars. That's a little bit more complicated than just having those samples in hand to do the work ourselves and just see it for ourselves. So it's a very exciting development. But I think the coolest thing, maybe the thing I was nerding out the most about, is that Ingenuity was also attached to the same mission. So this is a very bright picture, I apologize. But this was a helicopter or drone, whatever you want to call it, that was connected with Perseverance, and it made its first flight on April 19th. It basically hovered for about 10 minutes, and then it went back down to the surface of Mars, which doesn't sound super exciting on its own, just a helicopter flight, but this is the first helicopter flight on any other world beyond our own. So it can give us a lot of really good information about how to navigate other worlds, places like Titan perhaps, or other planets, whatever it might be. And they've made 4 successful flights. We'll keep our fingers crossed for 5, because number 5 was supposed to actually finish today. So I hope you guys get a chance to look that up. The exciting thing about today's flight, the 5th flight, was that it was going to take off and then land, but it wasn't going to land in the same place it took off from. So that's the kind of difference for that. And that was the exciting thing for Ingenuity. So research is still ongoing on Mars. But we have a closer neighbor that is currently trying to hide by the sun. But hopefully by the end of the month, if we have a clear western horizon, we'll be able to see Venus. By the summer, once we start really getting into summer, it'll be up higher on the horizon. So we'll be able to see it without fighting with the last light of the sun. But Venus has been shrouded in mystery for a very long time, somewhat literally because of those really thick clouds and the really thick atmosphere. So if you were to look at Venus with a really strong telescope, you would really just see a very bright circle. And honestly, when I was going to look at Venus for the first time through a telescope, I was like, okay, it's just going to be like a planet, cool. Like, I'm not that enthused. It was actually pretty neat. It was a crescent, which was really cool to see, but you're not going to see any of those same geographic features that you would see on Mars. But we have tried to make it down to the surface of Venus in the past. The first successful mission, this is, I know, a very blurry photo, but this was in the 1960s. It was the Soviet Union that, sorry, my dog's licking my hand and it's distracting me. The Soviet Union sent the first probe into the atmosphere, and it sent data back successfully from the Venera 4. So this was the 4th attempt. And then just to give you a sense of how hard it is to get information back from Venus, and also, sorry, and also how challenging it can be to just land something on the surface. This is an image from the Venera 13, so again from the Soviet Union. This has the distinction of being the first color photograph that we got from the surface of Venus. And this is kind of a photo manipulated from the original. The way they were able to do it, they basically had the camera do this weird like flop thing to take a panorama, and I want to call him a photoshopper, whoever it was, kind of stitched it together to look a little bit more like what we'd see But Venera 13 was not only the first to send a colored photograph back to Earth in 1982, but this was also the rover that had, or the lander that had the distinction of having the longest amount of time still communicating with Earth. So it was communicating with us for a whopping 127 minutes. That's it, before we lost communication. The last time we ever sent, as a planet, we ever sent something to land on Venus, on the surface of Venus, was in 1985. That's not to say that we don't still have ways to research Venus. Orbiters are the easiest thing. So this is a radar image from the Magellan, which is an orbiter around Venus. So we do have ways to see the surface and try to understand it looking through those clouds without just trying to use our ground telescopes here. But obviously there are a lot of really unique challenges that Venus poses to us, so we can try to study it and understand it. It's not that getting to Mars is easy, it's definitely not, but when you compare it to our closest neighbor, it's a lot easier than trying to navigate some of these. So this is an artist's impression. I don't know if there's actually lightning on Venus, but Venus does have a really thick atmosphere, as I stated. The clouds are also composed primarily of carbon dioxide and sulfuric acid. So there is sulfuric acid rain in the atmosphere above the surface of Venus. So first, you have to figure out how to get something to navigate that really, I keep wanting to say challenging, that really tricky atmosphere where sulfuric acid could easily eat away at any of the materials that you might use to build. Then on the surface, as we all know, Venus is very, very hot. It's so hot that that sulfuric acid rain never actually touches the surface. The surface of Venus is 850 degrees Fahrenheit on average, which is hotter than the melting point of lead. The pressure is also very intense. We consider like 1 bar of pressure to be equal to Earth's surface. So if you think, okay, this is something I can deal with, I'm not going to get crushed by the weight of the pressure around me, that's 1 bar, right? If any of you have ever gone scuba diving, you know that that pressure increases as you go down under the water. And there does get to be a point where you just can't go any further, and you have to be careful as you're coming back up to readjust to the pressure. The pressure on the surface of Venus is 92 bars. So we couldn't survive on the surface of Venus for a number of reasons, but trying to design a robot even to try to study and send back data like we have gotten from Mars that's reliable and something that can last for days on end has not been feasible so far. But Venus does have a lot of really interesting features, and I'm just going to cover a couple, and I promise I can talk about more than just volcanoes, but I'm going to just talk about volcanoes for this. So Venus has a lot of volcanoes, some of which are really unique to Venus. So the types of volcanoes that you find there, you don't find anywhere else, or you find very few other places. So there are these types of volcanoes are called pancake volcanoes, which makes me hungry, but they're very circular, broad, with very flat domes. And then you've got these ones, which I think are beautiful, but these are arachnoid volcanoes. So they've got these star-like fractures. Both of these, the pancake and the arachnoid, are unique to Venus. We have not yet found them on any other planetary body in the solar system. And then you've got these coronae volcanoes with these like wrinkled edges. Not corona, I'm saying coronae volcanoes. But they have been found on one other planetary body, and that is Miranda. And I will give you guys bonus credit if you don't have to Google which planet Miranda belongs to. But you can also find like channels formed by lava flow and other really interesting features on Venus. The really kind of unique thing about this planet is that its surface is very, very young. So there must have been some sort of resurfacing event that we don't really know about and we can't fully explain. We just don't see a lot of impact craters on the surface of Venus. So that's why they say, astronomers will say, hey, this is a very young planet. But the really exciting thing about Venus, a few months ago, there was a really big article about finding phosphine in the atmosphere of Venus. And this is a recent discovery. It was analyzing data from previous years, and the scientists did try to rule out every other possibility. And they weren't saying for certain that it means life. But the thing with phosphine is that for a long time, we have considered phosphine a potential biosignature. So if we somehow detected phosphine on an exoplanet, like a planet outside our solar system, say like, I don't know, we were like, oh, we found phosphine on HD 80606b, we would have no way to get closer to that planet to discover what that means. So it is very likely if that was the announcement, we would be saying, oh my gosh, there's life out there, because we wouldn't have any way to say that that's not true. But because Venus is so close to us and we have that advantage of being able to go closer and figure out if phosphine really should be a biosignature, maybe there's something else that produces it. Maybe we shouldn't be counting this as the sole source of potential life on other extrasolar worlds. Or maybe there are microbes that really like that extreme environment in the atmosphere of Venus that's producing that phosphine. So we don't know until we go over there and find out. And that's the really exciting thing about both Mars and Venus, and really all of the planetary bodies in our solar system. There's so much that we have yet to learn about, and we are still discovering to this day. So it's very exciting. And Rick, with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to you.
All right. Thank you, Kelly. Those are fantastic photos and graphics. That was really an interesting list of facts about those planets that you just don't run into every day. So that was great. Thank you. Okay, let us continue. Before I continue with the night sky, let me show you one additional photograph that we hesitated to bring up, but I'll bring it up anyway, just briefly. And that is these mushrooms found on Mars. This was just came out today, actually. And these little round balls, there is the paper by Joseph and some others in Advances in Microbiology that suggests that these are actually mushrooms growing on Mars. And you can see on the left image that there are a few. On the right image, you can see the same ones, but with a bunch of others as well. And they claim for various reasons it wasn't just the sand uncovering these. But of course, it's very controversial. And the previous theory for these kinds of objects on Mars was hematite, which is caused by iron in flowing water. If you can see that, this is one from Utah, not from Mars, that's formed in the same way that they proposed the hematite balls forming on Mars. And if instead of looking straight down at it, you look at it from the side, it actually does look a bit like a mushroom. But that is caused by flowing water containing iron, which we know there is quite a bit of on Mars because of the red color of the sand. So it's still very controversial. I wouldn't hold my breath on that one. Now, let me move back to the night sky. See if that works. Yes, okay. So we talked about Mercury, Venus, and Mars. We're going to now turn the ground back on and move over a bit. So now you can see from the letters at the bottom, we're looking toward the east, maybe a little bit to the southeast. And you can see some bright stars. Arcturus is the brightest one. Spica is very bright. And then if you, let's see, whoops, let me look up first. a little bit, you can see this triangle. Yeah, I'll do the triangle first. Whoops. Back out. Of Arcturus, Spica, and Regulus in Leo the Lion. And this forms a very distinctive triangle. This is a very famous triangle of the spring triangle. There's another configuration here. If I go down a bit, whoops, and get rid of Regulus, Spica, Arcturus, and now the nebula in the tail of Leo, and the head star in Canis Venatici, Cor Corollae, show, if I'll take away constellations in a moment, you can see this diamond shape. That's called the Great Spring Diamond. And let me remove these so you just see the stars, and you can see this diamond shape. Now, of course, to find Arcturus and get started with this process, the easiest way to do that is to notice that Ursa Major, which includes the Big Dipper, is right here due, bring the ground back again, due east. So here's the Big Dipper. It's kind of pointing upright, and the water is pouring over its handle here, which is why it rains so much in the spring in the East Coast. And this handle has an arc to it. You follow the arc to Arcturus. Many of you are getting tired of hearing about that, but anyway, that's how you find Arcturus. The Little Dipper is a little bit farther over, right here. And of course, the handle of the Little Dipper is Polaris, and the pointer stars point to Polaris. So let's go back to this configuration and notice the major constellations here are Leo and Virgo, and of course the Big Dipper and Ursa Major. If I were to zoom out a bit, Hercules is down in the lower left corner. So there is some mythology here. Excuse me. Hercules, well, had a number of tasks that he was required to do at some point, including the trying to fight the Nemean lion. Leo represents the Nemean lion. Hercules had to fight this lion. It was weapons would not penetrate its skin, so he tried arrows, and that didn't work. He finally just wrapped his arms around it and strangled it to death, and then used its own claws to cut a coat of armor out of its very tough hide, and that became very useful in his further adventures. So Hercules fighting the Nemean lion is preserved up here. And then Virgo, the maiden, represents Astrea. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Zeus had sent Pandora to the earth to punish mankind for and he was not happy with what humans were doing on the earth. So Pandora opened her box and released a plague of hate, envy, sickness, and so on. And it was so unbearable that one by one, the gods left and went back to the heavens. Astrea was the last one to leave, and she was commemorated by the constellation Virgo. Now, I'm going to turn off my video because you may be able to see, depending on your configuration, you may be able to see a little bit more of the screen if I do that. We're going to look at a couple of things. First, we're going to look at M51, which is called the Whirlpool Galaxy. It's at a distance of about 23 million light years. Whoops, I did that too soon. Let me do that again and zoom in. And you can see that the Whirlpool Galaxy has a companion galaxy that is interacting with it. And in fact, it appears that it may have, the companion galaxy may have passed through M51 and then be on its way back inside it again So there are a couple of colliding galaxies here. There is another one that I will mention. Let me zoom out a little bit more. The M104, called the Sombrero Galaxy, looks quite different because it is also a spiral galaxy, but we are seeing it edge on. And so we're looking along the edge of the pancake. This is what we think our galaxy would look like if seen edge on. And you can see the dust of the flat pancake part of the galaxy obscuring the stars in the plane of the galaxy. We'll go back out again. You can see that it's just off the tip of Virgo. Whoops, wrong one. Finally, let me mention the Black Eye Galaxy, which again looks quite different from the others. There is a very heavy dust area in the center of the galaxy, so it looks like it has a black eye, but it's dust obscuring our view of that particular spiral galaxy. All right, now let me go to something a little bit different, and that is M13. M13 is what we call a globular cluster. These are hundreds of thousands of stars that were all formed at about the same time. And it's a relatively recent cluster, an old cluster, excuse me, the opposite of recent. It's one of the oldest clusters we think in our galaxy. It was first recognized as individual stars in 1779. And in 1974, the at the time, largest radio telescope on the planet was in Arecibo, Puerto Rico, sent a coded message to M13 because there are so many stars. And of course, now we know that planets around almost every star. In this particular part of our galaxy, it's within our own galaxy. And it's about 25,000 light years away, as opposed to the 25 to 30 million light years of the galaxies I previously showed. So this is in our own galaxy, 25,000 light years away. And the Arecibo encoded message had information about humans, DNA, the Earth, where we're located, and so on. And there was some controversy at the time about whether that was really a good idea. But it's so far away, I don't know that we're going to be too worried about aliens coming to see what we're up to. Also, I'll just mention for those of you who happen to be science fiction fanatics that the Doctor Who show about the Cybermen and the artificial nova they created in 1968 was when this Doctor Who episode, The Wheel of Space, took place. And the nova was created in this globular cluster of M13. So there's the science fiction tie-in. All right. Now, the last thing I'd like to talk about is to move, not just in space this time, but also in time. Go a little, whoops. Stay in the same rough part of the sky, but I'm going to try to move to, let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4:45 in the morning. You can see the numbers in the lower part of the screen. So this is 4:45 in the morning. Let's go a little bit farther to the east. And you can see the two brightest objects, which are Jupiter and Saturn. There are not a lot of really obvious constellations in this part of the sky. But let's zoom in on Jupiter. Actually, let me do it a slightly different way. Center it first and then zoom in. And if you have a pair of binoculars, you can probably, you won't be able to see the structure on Jupiter, but you can probably see that there are 4 points next to it. A small telescope will clearly show these 4 points. These are the large moons of Jupiter, the so-called Galilean moons, because they were discovered by Galileo. And if you have a large enough telescope, you might actually even be able to see the bands on the planet itself. And the moons are just lined up in a line along to the right of the planet. Let me move over to Saturn. Again, we'll center that. Whoops. And zoom in. Now with binoculars, you might be able to tell it's a little bit elongated because of these rings. And a small telescope, you can actually see the rings and maybe even the division in the rings if it's a really clear night. And here are some of the brighter moons, larger moons of Saturn. In fact, the only one you might be able to see in a large enough telescope is probably Titan. The others may be a little bit too dim unless you really have a large scope. But these are available to view only, I'm afraid, in the very early hours of the morning. So around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, you can see they're in the east, so they're just rising. And of course, it's going to be dawn soon. So that is an issue for that. So that's all I'd like to talk about regarding objects in the night sky. But I do want to talk a little bit more about a very specific phenomena that is going to be happening toward the end of the month. And that is the full super blood moon eclipse that will occur on May 26th at early in the morning. And I'll show you a few things about that. So the moon's orbit is an ellipse, right? It has a point called the perigee where it is closest to the Earth, and a point called the apogee where it is farthest from the Earth in its orbit. It takes a month to go through around this orbit, of course. And at perigee, when the moon is closest, it's a little closer to the Earth, so it appears to be a little bit larger. At apogee or away, if apogee is away, the moon is a little farther from the Earth, it's a little smaller. If you superimpose those two, you can see that the moon can be as much as 14% larger or 30% brighter. I actually, when I just look at the moon, I can't tell if it's larger by that small amount or not, but it might appear a little bit brighter to the naked eye. There is a slightly increased tidal force resulting in the perigean spring tides, but only measured in inches usually, unless you're in a very unusual geography area. The moon is indeed a little bit closer during a supermoon to the Earth, but the gravitational effect is very small. Some people say it causes emotional consequences, but studies have shown that that doesn't seem to hold up. The gravitational influence of the moon around your head on average is about a little less than a mosquito buzzing around your head. So it's unlikely to have a significant effect. Now, the moon's orbit around the Earth is inclined by 5 degrees. And so these small planes represent the moon's orbit. The large plane represents the Earth's orbit around the sun. And if you look at the diagram over to the right here, you see that the shadow from the sun on the moon, when the moon is at new moon or between the Earth and the sun, is a little cone, and it ends up above the Earth. So there's no eclipse of any sort. If the moon is full and it's, say, below this plane, then again, the Earth's shadow misses the moon, and so there's no lunar eclipse. However, if you look at the near diagram, you can see that the orbit of the moon just happens to be just right for the moon to be new when it is within the plane of the Earth's orbit. And so the shadow from the moon will hit the Earth in a very narrow line as the Earth rotates and the moon continues in its orbit. And that's called a solar eclipse. When the moon is full, and it's in the other part of the sky, so the sun is here, the Earth in the middle, and the moon is on the far side of the Earth, then the moon could enter the Earth's shadow, and we could have a lunar eclipse. This shows that from a different perspective. So here to the left, the moon is between the sun and the Earth. The moon's shadow falls onto the Earth to produce a solar eclipse. The other diagram is when the moon is on the other side of the Earth. We have a full moon now. And when that moon moves into the Earth's shadow, we have a lunar eclipse. This is another diagram showing the sun, the Earth, and the moon moving into the Earth's shadow to produce this eclipse. This is if you're on the Earth looking up at the moon during a lunar eclipse, you might see something like this, where during totality, it turns a blood red. Note that the moon is red because red light is bent more through the Earth's atmosphere. The blue light is scattered away. And so this red light illuminates the moon with a blood red color. If you were standing on the moon and looking back at the Earth, to the left here, you see a diagram looking back at the nighttime part of the Earth, and you see this orange atmosphere around it where the red light has been bent through the Earth's atmosphere. And the more dust and pollutants there are in the atmosphere at that time, the more you'll be, the redder that color will become. The one on the right is actually a composite photograph. It's a photograph of the Earth taken by Apollo, actually, and one of the Apollo missions. And the Japanese Kaguya lunar probe in 2009, during an actual lunar eclipse, took a photograph of the Earth, and it shows this orange tint to the Earth's atmosphere. So the gradation is a little more realistic than the artist rendering. So the lunar eclipse in culture was interesting. Many cultures saw animals devouring the moon, especially since it's blood red at that time. The Egyptians saw a sow swallowing the moon. In China, there was a three-legged toad swallowing the moon. The Mayans and Incas imagined a jaguar swallowing the moon, and hence there was a great deal of shouting and holding spears and shaking spears at the moon to get the jaguar to let go of the moon. The Mesopotamians had 7 demons who not only covered the moon, but they would also attack their king. So a false king was appointed for the day. They were able to predict eclipses for the day of the lunar eclipse. And then the next day after the eclipse was over, the real king came back out of hiding so that the demons wouldn't find him. And the fake king somehow disappeared. We won't talk about what happened to him. The Greeks, on the other hand, used the Earth's shadow on the moon as evidence that the Earth is round, not flat. The Earth's shadow, of course, during the partial phases of the lunar eclipse, shows a distinct curvature to it. In March 1504, there was a lunar eclipse that was recorded in the almanacs of the day, including those used by navigators. So Christopher Columbus predicted this lunar eclipse to show the natives of Jamaica that he was godlike. The Jamaicans, when he first landed, gave them food and kind of took care of them. They got kind of tired of this after about 6 months. And Christopher Columbus's folks were beginning to get really hungry. So he knew this lunar eclipse was coming up, and he told them that he was going to make the eclipse, the moon, go away and be swallowed into a blood red ball if they didn't provide additional food. So the eclipse did occur. The natives did eventually agree to restore the food exchange. And so in exchange for the food, Christopher Columbus allowed the regular moon to come back again. And he was supplied by food for the next few months until he left. Now, this is an example of a total lunar eclipse. This particular one happened in 2015. It was in the evening instead of the morning. So if you were to look toward the east, toward the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, around sunset, you would see a view like the left view. And on the right, you see the moon beginning to rise sort of a yellow color from the atmospheric effects. When it gets above the mountains, it becomes more of the whitish moon that we're used to. And then a little later on, it becomes totally eclipsed, and you see the blood red, in this case, another supermoon. Now, this eclipse will occur on Wednesday, May 26th, and it will only last 14 minutes, but the totality begins May 26th at 5:11 in the morning. So you have to be an early riser or a very late night person to see this one. Maximum is at 5:18. Again, only lasts for 14 minutes. It actually, the partial phases of the eclipse do not conclude until after the moon is set below the horizon. So it's still in partial eclipse when it sets. Another inconvenient point is that the sunrise is about 5:48 a.m. So by 5 o'clock, it's beginning to get a little light from the sunrise. So the best time to see this eclipse is to maybe see the partial phases around 4 o'clock and then stay until totality ends at 5:18, or at least go out around 5 o'clock and see totality and then go back in and go back to bed. Where is it going to be? This is a screenshot showing the typical horizon here. And here's the moon, just barely above the horizon. Remember, it sets during the end of the eclipse. So you need to find some place where there is a clear view to the west in order to see this eclipse. For example, if you go to the ball fields in White Rock and look to the west, there are the Jemez Mountains there, but they're pretty low from the ball fields or the overlook area. And so you might be able to see the eclipse at that point. If you'd like more information about the eclipse, you can go to timeanddate.com and just type in May lunar eclipse. And for a location, put in Santa Fe. It's close enough to Los Alamos for this. And you'll get all the information you need about time and date of the eclipse. The last thing I'll mention is if you're interested in taking a photograph of the eclipse, one thing that works nicely is to have a telephoto lens and put something interesting in the foreground. The Jemez Mountains aren't that great, but if you have more better ideas than I have, you can try to find something interesting to put in the foreground during the eclipse. In terms of photographs, these pictures that I'm showing, I took with a 600 millimeter lens, so a telephoto lens. The partial phase, again, notice that the Earth's shadow is round, and since the Earth is rotating all this time, it remains round, so it's not flat, it's spherical. At any rate, it's almost bright sunshine like it is during the day on the Earth here in this part of the moon. But because of the partial eclipse, I would suggest a little bit longer exposure. For an ISO of 400 and f5.6, I used a 1600th of a second. For the total phase of the eclipse, when it's really red, depending on how dark it is, if there are a lot of, hopefully not fires around, but that tends to make it darker red, you end up with a exposure that's much longer. I set my camera on a tripod, and at ISO 800 f4, it was a half a second exposure. So those are just some numbers to start with, and then you can vary the exposure around those numbers. So that's all we had to talk about today. If you have some questions, you can type those into the chat window, and Laura will relay those questions to us. Thank you for being here this evening.
Okay, so we do have some questions. We had a couple from Galen come in. Rick, please mention the Pajarito Astronomer's Dark Night to occur Saturday, May 15th.
All right, thank you, Galen. That's a very good point. Hopefully it will be a clear night. May 15th, it usually starts around sunset or maybe an hour after sunset because, you know, the sky is still pretty light right after sunset. They will probably be some people there who can point out Mercury, because again, that's going to be close to the greatest elongation. Venus may be visible by that time. And then we'll probably have some folks out who can look at some deep sky objects as well. So that's Saturday, May 15th at the ball fields, again, Overlook Park in White Rock. Thank you, Galen.
Cool. And then Galen also had a question for Kelli. What accounts for the variety of morphologies of the volcanoes on Venus? Are some types concentrated at certain latitudes or in certain hemispheres? Oh, Kelli, you're muted. There we go.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not really sure. I know when I was looking up the photos for each of the different types of volcanoes, it was hard to even find photos and examples of those. I think, and I don't want to say for certain, but I think that, based on the fact that we don't really know what caused that resurfacing event, there might be still a lot of things that we don't know about Venus. So we might uncover whether it's like, and I don't know, maybe it is concentrated in one spot, but maybe that's contributing to those types of volcanoes, or maybe not. I don't know. Yeah, great question.
Yeah, if anyone else has some suggestions, atmosphere, or I don't know, something else, let us know in the chat.
Definitely.
Meanwhile, Susan asks, are there any plans to send a probe to Olympus Mons?
I don't know if there are any plans to send probes to Olympus Mons. Right now, the focus has been going to those places where water might have been, because we're hoping to find microbes or fossils. There's always, whenever NASA decides to, and I'm sure it's similar in other countries, but I know when NASA is choosing which landing sites, they usually have narrowed it down to a handful. Sometimes it comes down to what would be best based on like the rotation of the planet and where we are in our orbit and Mars is in its orbit. But a lot of it comes down to what we want to know. And NASA usually will open it up to comments. And I don't know if it's public comments or just scientific comments, but they usually get, input. It's not just one person being like, I want to go here. But usually the focus is trying to find, I think a lot of times the focus is, oh, we're looking for life, but really we're just trying to understand what might have happened to Mars in the past. If we find life, it's kind of that added benefit. But I think knowing what happened where these places that had water, what happened there is kind of the focus right now. That might change in the future.
One interesting thing about that is that I think Kelly's exactly right about the focus being on places with, that might have water or life. But now that we have an aircraft on Mars, if future aircraft were to be able to have a much longer range and higher altitude capabilities, I don't know that they ever will, but if they do, then that might be a possibility to land on Olympus Mons. Right now, I don't think you would want to try to put a rover down there because the geography is way too rough, or Marsography, whatever, is a little too rough for the rover to survive a nice landing. But an aircraft may be able to get up there at some point and check it out. Long time before that happens, though.
Yeah, and the whole point of Ingenuity, as exciting as it was to have the first flight, its mission was as like a demonstration. Is this possible? So if the first flight wasn't successful, it wouldn't have been considered a failure, because the whole point of Ingenuity was to test whether we could have something fly in the thin atmosphere of Mars. So now that we have gotten past that stage, now they're working on like operation demonstrations, seeing what's possible with Ingenuity, and they can kind of build from there. So yeah.
Cool. Lisa asks, how did the ancient peoples predict lunar eclipses?
That's a really good question. They're really amazing. They also predicted solar eclipses, and they noted that there is an 18-year cycle for solar eclipses, and then the sort of twice-a-year cycle for lunar eclipses that have to do with the relative orbits of the Earth and the moon. They didn't realize that that's what was going on, but just careful observations over generations, people carefully writing down things, they noticed patterns. And then they wrote up eclipse calculators that were little dials, sort of like a circular slide rule that we might have today, that could be used to try to determine when those eclipses would happen. And the earliest one of those that I recall is from the Middle East from about 2200 BC. So that was a really long time ago. We also know that the Chinese were able to predict eclipses very, very early. So a couple of millennia, or at least a millennia or so, BC was when they figured out how to do that. And they were precise enough, not to the hour or minute like we are now, but to the day, that they could predict an eclipse. And there were actually two Chinese astrologers at the time who failed to predict a lunar eclipse. And remember that story about the emperor would have to hide because these demons might grab him and carry him off if they could find him during an eclipse. And they failed to predict the eclipse, and the tablet that we have suggests that they were executed because they failed to predict that eclipse. And that occurred in over a millennium BC.
Interesting. Going back to the flying over Olympus Mons, Galen notes that the air is much too thin over Olympus Mons, so you need a much fancier aircraft in order to do that.
Yeah, you need rockets or something like that to boost. Presumably you would use, have the rover down at the foot of the mountain, use rotors to get as high as you could, and then you'd have to use rockets basically to go the rest of the way, which doesn't seem so far-fetched when you think about that video of that huge, massive SpaceX Starship landing vertically. And who knows what might be available in the next 20 years.
Yeah.
Well, and I think too, the fact that, people are now setting their sights on setting foot on Mars as well. Maybe that's something that humans will want to do for ourselves, is climb the highest mountain on Mars rather than send an aircraft or a rocket or anything up there. So who knows?
That seems like an interesting goal. I think that's all the questions we had in the chat. I wrote one down. When Rick, you were talking about the Black Eye Galaxy and the Sombrero Galaxy, what is the composition of dust in galaxies? Like, what is the dust in those galaxies made of?
Yeah, really good question. So as far as we can tell, and this is done largely through spectroscopy and so on, to try to see what the components of the dust are. And sometimes you use radio waves, sometimes optical, sometimes infrared, so on, X-rays. But we can kind of probe the composition of things. And as far as we can tell, both the gas and the dust in those galaxies is essentially comparable to our own, depending on the age of the galaxy. Now, if there's some galaxies that are very far away and very young, they mostly are composed of hydrogen and helium, and fewer of the heavier elements. If they're only a few million light years away, like the ones that I discussed, they're more similar time frame to our own galaxy. So stars have had time to grow through their lifetime, become supernova at the end of their life, spread material into the interstellar space. And we believe it happens the same way in those galaxies that it happens in our own galaxy. And that spreads this material that was formed by the nuclear processes in the star and the explosion itself, or maybe collisions between neutron stars. We found that that seems to produce some heavy elements as well. And all of those, one of the first things produced is carbon. So hydrogen burning to helium, which burns the carbon, then oxygen, nitrogen, and so on. And the carbon is basically soot, right? So that's dust. So the black stuff, a lot of that is basically carbon.
Cool. That's really interesting. Thank you. So it doesn't look like we have any more chats. So I think with that, we're gonna wrap up here. Kelli and Rick, thank you so much again for presenting with us tonight those pictures from Kelli were really cool. And I will be sure to look out for the lunar eclipse as well. Thanks again for tuning in. Good night, everyone.